so drawn to talent and ability and gifting. And we kind of elevate people who are tremendously talented. They preach so powerfully. And we elevate that without really giving enough thought to, but what's their character like? Well, hello and welcome to Sunday Morning with Hope Valley Church. I'm Pastor Sam. I'm the lead pastor here at Hope Valley, and today we are picking up in our verse-by-verse study through the book of Acts. And today we're actually picking up in chapter 6, verse 8. We read verses 1 through 7 in our last lesson, and today we're going to be picking up in verse 8. And before I do, let me just kind of get you caught up in case you've missed where we've been so far. Let me just get caught up a little bit so we can launch right here into the second half of chapter 6. So what we read in the first half of the chapter was that Stephen, along with 6 others, had been appointed to lead the ministry to the widows of the church, right? And there had been this issue where one of the groups of widows had not been being properly cared for because of some cultural and language issues. And so he had been appointed, along with 6 others, to be the 7 men overseeing that ministry to make sure these people were being taken care of. And he had been selected for this role because of the evidence that he was submitted to the Holy Spirit in his personal life, along with the other 6 guys. And what does it mean to be filled with the Spirit, right? Because it says that he was full of the Spirit. Really being filled with the Spirit, the most simple way to understand that is that being filled with the Spirit means to be empowered by God. People are filled with the Spirit by submitting to God, humbling themselves, and obeying Him. And then through that, they are empowered by His Spirit. And so today we're going to explore that question. And the question I want you to have in your mind, really, as we read through these next several verses, we're going to be reading verse 8 to 15, is how do you know someone is filled with the Holy Spirit? Very simple question. How do you know someone is filled with the Holy Spirit? So have that question in your mind, and let's pick up here, Acts chapter 6, verse 8, and we're going to be reading to the end of the chapter, verse 15. It says, "Now Stephen, full of grace and power, was performing great wonders and signs among the people. An opposition arose, however, from some members of the Freedmen's Synagogue, composed of both Cyrenians and Alexandrians, and some were from Cilicia and Asia. And they began to argue with Stephen, but they were unable to stand up against his wisdom and the Spirit by whom he was speaking. Then they secretly persuaded some men to say, 'We have heard him speaking blasphemous words against Moses and God.' They stirred up the people, the elders, and the scribes. And so they came, seized him, and took him to the Sanhedrin. They also presented false witnesses who said, 'This man never stops speaking against this holy place and the law, for we heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs that Moses handed down to us.' And all who were sitting in the Sanhedrin looked intently at him and saw that his face was like the face of an angel." All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of just unpack what we saw there in these several verses, okay? So let's just walk back and just kind of examine some of the main points, some of the key points we saw in verse 8 through 15. The first is that the power of the Holy Spirit was evident, not just in Stephen's ability, but also it was evident in his character, right? The power of the Holy Spirit was evident in Stephen's character. It was not just what Stephen did, but it's how he went about it, right? Because look at verse 8. It said, Stephen was full of grace and power, right? He was performing great wonders and signs among the people. Even while performing these incredible works, Stephen wasn't arrogant or self-elevating. That's what it's describing here, right? He was full of grace. And so we actually see this kind of connect with later when Paul is writing to the Galatians, and he's talking about the fruit of the Spirit. And the fruit of the Spirit means, the evidence that you are filled with the Spirit. And the fruit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. That's Galatians 5:22 through 23. So that's how we see Stephen being described, right? That the power of the Holy Spirit was evident in him, not just because of what he could do, not just because of his talent or his ability, or even the supernatural, miraculous power in which he was ministering, but it was also because of his character. He was full of grace, right? And really, more than likely, his reputation among the people really triggered his enemies just as much as the things he was teaching did, right? So that's the first major point that we saw here. And then secondly, we saw that Stephen's words and his character together made him really formidable, right? The empowerment of the Holy Spirit put Stephen really in a different class altogether than his enemies. And we saw this in verse 10 when it said they were unable to stand up against his wisdom and the spirit by which he was speaking. Of course, he's talking about the Holy Spirit there, right? But it's evident that he was so full of the Spirit, both in the way that he conducted himself, but also in the way that he ministered and the things that he did, and the things that he spoke, right? That they were completely unable to stand up against him. It probably would have been easier for his enemies, really, if they could have found some kind of character weakness to exploit, right? Because this is actually a common thing that we see happen in humanity, right? There's no shortage of people that are tremendously talented, really people that do incredible things. And at some point in their life, kind of a weakness in their character, or maybe a weakness in their character that's always been there, is revealed or it's exploited by their enemies, and that's how they get brought down, right? They're not brought down because of their ability, because they fail. They're brought down because their character is weak, and that's what defeats them. And yet, Stephen's enemies clearly did not have that kind of an opportunity with him, because his character and his talent and his gifting and his ability in the Holy Spirit, these things were all in line with each other. And so they were completely unable to stand against him, right? Because of that, really, their only option was to lie about him, right? The only way to get him out of their way, because clearly things that he was saying and doing, they didn't like. But they couldn't argue him down. They couldn't disprove him. So instead, they just had to eliminate him through lies, right? And so we saw that in verse 12 through 13, right? They stirred up the people, and they also presented false witnesses, right? They got people to lie about Stephen and say that he was saying things that he wasn't saying and doing, right? His enemies literally had to make up faults with his words and his character. It's interesting. Last thing we saw here, because it's a pretty simple passage, but it's something that I want us to reflect on today, is that Stephen's personal closeness to God was obvious. That's this last verse we saw, right? That all who were sitting in the Sanhedrin looked intently at him, and they saw that his face was like the face of an angel, right? In other words, Stephen was visibly different because of the presence of God in his life, and because of the time that he was clearly spending in God's presence, right? It's not saying that he looked sweet and kind. You know, like in modern language, we might say like, oh, they look like an angel. Oh, look at that baby. They're like the face of an angel, or, you know, or they're so, and what we mean is they're so sweet and innocent looking. That's not what this phrase means in this culture. When they say that his face looked like the face of an angel, they're saying his face looks like a person who spends time in the presence of God. It might literally be saying that his face actually had like a visible glow to it. This is actually one possible interpretation, and it might be both of those things, right? But whether or not his face like literally had a glow from God's presence in his life, or if they're just saying that they could tell that he had been in God's presence, either way, the end result is the same. He was visibly someone who had spent time in the presence of God. He was visibly somebody who was full of the Spirit of God. That's what that statement means. It's pretty incredible. And we also saw that his closeness to God was obvious, not just because of that statement, but because of the fact that Stephen was really personally, really non-defensive and clearly very confident, right? And none of this does Stephen seem to be, and we'll see this even more in the next chapter as we read more of the conversation that Stephen has with the Sanhedrin, right? But what we see in Stephen's character is that he's non-defensive and he's incredibly confident, right? Where does that come from? Well, clearly it comes from the Holy Spirit, right? It's part and parcel of being filled with the Spirit is this confidence. And really, if we go and look at 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 4 and 5, Paul kind of gives some more voice to this phenomenon of the confidence that we have when we're really following the Lord, when we're submitted to His leading and we're filled with His Spirit. In verse 4 of 2 Corinthians 3, it says, "Such is the confidence that we have through Christ before God. It is not that we are competent in ourselves to claim anything as coming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God." And this even kind of echoes some of what we saw Peter say back when they healed the crippled man by the temple, right? If you guys remember that back, I think it was chapter 3 or 4, right? Is that Peter looks at everybody and says, "Why are you looking at us as if we have done something?" He's saying this is from God, not from Peter and John. Paul's saying that. And really we see that being evidenced in the way that Stephen carried himself, right? Because when you understand that your adequacy comes from God, not from your own competence, it actually gives you a tremendous amount of confidence because now your confidence is based on who God is, not based on who you are. And that's what we saw in Stephen's life. It's one of the evidences that he really was filled with the Spirit, right? So Stephen was clearly concerned with defending the truth of God. That's clear. But not in personally defending himself. We don't see him get offended or take anything personally or try to defend his own reputation, but we do see him very strongly defending the truth of God. Because Stephen seemed to utterly lack personal insecurity. And so that's one of the things, as we talk about takeaways and some big ideas today, that I want us to focus on, because there's a clear relationship here between what I would describe as gifting, and gifting would be like talent and ability. There's a clear relationship with the Lord between gifting and character, right? When the Holy Spirit is working in you, He brings both, right? He brings both. This is one of the ways that we know the Holy Spirit is working in somebody, when we see both of these things, not just one of these things, okay? So now we're going to move into just how we're going to look at applying what we read. So we read the passage, we're examining the passage, but now let's kind of lift out what are some of the big ideas that we can apply in our own lives. So the first question I want you to think about is, what are the big ideas that you saw in this passage, right? As you were reading through it, listening to it maybe, what are some of the big ideas that you saw? And then how can you apply those ideas in your life? Like what might be some of your next steps? As you're thinking about those questions, let me just share with you some of the things I wrote down personally as I was reading through this for myself and just thinking about some of those big ideas and applications. The first thing I have written here is that the evidence of being filled with God's Spirit is not just in what you can do, but it's in how you conduct yourself, right? The evidence of being filled with the Spirit of God is not just evidenced in what you can do, but it's evidenced in how you conduct yourself. And I think this is something that oftentimes as humans we really forget, right? We're so drawn to talent and ability and gifting, and we kind of elevate people who are tremendously talented and tremendously gifted, and they're so good at what they do. Even in the church we do this a lot. They preach so powerfully, they minister so wonderfully, and we elevate that and we elevate that and we put people on platforms without really giving enough thought to, but what's their character like? What are they like when they're not on the stage, right? Because you see this all over the world. You see it in the church, you see it in the secular world, you see it everywhere. It's a human problem. We elevate people who are gifted without thinking enough about character. But God cares a lot about character. In fact, I believe biblically what we're taught is that character is more important than gifting, right? Gifting is great, but character matters more, because if you don't have character, your gifting leads you into ruin, right? And that's kind of my second big idea that I have written here, is that talent without character gives the enemy many openings to exploit. We see that play out time and time and time again in the public eye, in our personal lives, in the lives of people that we know, right? Where when you have talent, when you're gifted, but you don't have character to back it up, it gives the enemy so many openings that they can exploit in your life. And so that's another big idea that I saw here, because what we saw was that Stephen's enemies, they were trying to take Stephen down, but they couldn't because he wasn't giving them an opening. He had the talent, he had the gifting, he had the power, but he had the character that was in line with all of it. That was how everyone around Stephen knew this man's full of the Holy Spirit, because he's got the gifting and the character. And as a result of that, his enemies had nothing they could exploit. So they had to make things up, right? That's interesting. So what I have written here for just some of the ways that I can apply these ideas in my own life and maybe some next steps for myself, I wrote, I need to rely more on God and less on my own ability and knowledge. That's one of my takeaways today, right? I need to rely more on God and less on my own ability and my own knowledge. And the second thing I wrote here is that I need to submit to the Holy Spirit, both to work in me, that's the character part, and also through me, that's the gifting and talent part, right? If you want to think of those categories that way. So I need to submit to the Holy Spirit, both to work in me and through me, right? Because the Holy Spirit's going to do both of those things. And I need to submit and submit myself to Him so that He can do those two things, right? So not resisting Him. So those are some of my applications and next steps. Let me leave you with, I want to give you something to pray about today, and then a devotional question to really ponder and think through this week. And the thing I have to pray about today is ask the Lord to gently reveal areas of your character that He wants to mature. And the Lord will do that gently, right? Because that can be really hard to hear from anybody, even from God, right? Is what are the areas in my life where, frankly, I'm pretty immature and I need to grow up, right? So I just would invite you today, really all of us, that we would pray that the Lord would gently reveal areas of our character where we need to mature. And the devotional question I have for you is, how might neglecting to spend time in God's presence be causing defensiveness, insecurity, or anxiety in your life? Okay, how might you be causing defensiveness, insecurity, anxiety in your life by neglecting to spend time in the presence of God? Right? Because Stephen didn't seem to have any defensiveness, any insecurity, or any anxiety at all. Why? Because he'd spent time in the presence of God. He was full of the Spirit of God, right? So in what ways personally have you maybe been neglecting to spend time in the presence of God, and as a result, there's defensiveness and insecurity and anxiety welling up, maybe some other things as well, okay? So think about that question this week, and again, I invite you to pray for the Lord's revelation today personally for you. Well, I hope this time has been really helpful for you and blessing, and I just thank you for being here, and hope that you'll continue with us as we continue through the book of Acts. In our next lesson, we're going to be beginning to walk through Stephen's sermon that he gives to the Sanhedrin, and we're going to take through 3 lessons, 3 weeks, just to focus on that, because there's a lot going on there, and we're going to unpack some of the things that he has to say to them as they begin to question him. So I hope you'll continue through the series with us, and just pray that it's a blessing for you. In the meantime, have a great day. All right, goodbye.
We are so glad you have joined us today. To learn more about Hope Valley Church and get access to free resources, just go to www.hopevalley.church. There, you will also find links to connect with us on Facebook and Instagram, as well as links to our podcasts, now available on Apple, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please take a moment to like and subscribe so you can stay up with new videos coming out every week. Hope Valley is a church based in Winchester, Virginia that meets in homes around the region. So if you'd like to find out more about home churches, how they work, and how to locate one near you, just go to hopevalley.church/house. Thanks again for joining us, and may God bless you today.